Good grief. It's a YouTube channel business interlude, Charlie Brown. You may have noticed that I recently published a Game Boy System retrospective under the name Game Boy Works Volume 2, even though I already published a Game Boy System retrospective a decade ago. Well, you know, a lot can change in the space of 10 years. A decade ago today, I published a frankly terrible little video about Nintendo's alleyway that nevertheless got this entire channel rolling into the low viewership, life-consuming time sink that it is today. A lot has changed since then, and I don't just mean my video quality. For starters, the worldwide Game Boy Works project has become too expensive for me to carry on. When I first embarked on Game Boy Works as Game Boy World, no one cared about Game Boy. The entire reason I focused on the Game Boy in the first place was that it was a platform that I knew and loved, but for which I could find materials at a reasonable price. I sat down and priced out games and quickly realized that I couldn't afford to acquire games in boxes to photograph for Super NES or NES on a games journalist's salary. Meanwhile, there were only a handful of Game Boy releases that cost more than $100 complete. The Japanese lineup was even more affordable. Unfortunately, actual collectors came to the same realization a few years later, and Game Boy has seen probably the biggest price inflation of any major console in terms of percent increase in prices over the past decade. So I'm scaling back and giving up on the international aspect of Game Boy in order to focus strictly on US releases, lining them up alongside their contemporary releases on NES. It's kind of a shame because I really did enjoy stumbling across worthwhile import obscurities like Astro Rabby and Roadster. Heck, my video for Ayakashi no Shiro even inspired someone to create a translation hack for the game, which actually made me feel like I was doing something worthwhile with this project. On the other hand, I'm not going to miss all the mahjong and horse racing and pachinko games. I have to deal with enough of those in my side projects covering forgotten consoles like Casio PV1000 and Tomy Puta. Anyway, over the past 2 or 3 years, my plan for this channel has finally come into focus. I realize that this means it took me something like 7 years to figure it out, but I never said I was good at planning. NES Works has really firmed up to become the central through line of this channel, and I'd like to move ahead with that mindset. My hope is that by the end of 1989, I'll have brought Seigaiden coverage even with the NES Chronology. And so it makes sense to turn Game Boy Works into a parallel side project for NES Works as well, since that's pretty much how Nintendo treated the system. So my goal for the next year and a half or so is to wrap up NES Works 1989 and Seigaiden through the end of '89, take some time off to dabble in Metroidvania Works for the 1990s, and then dive into NES Works 1990. Eventually in this fashion, I'll even catch up to where Super NES Works is. Game Boy Works will be getting a little bit of a do-over as part of this process, since the Japanese and US chronologies for this system rarely lined up. Also, the first year or so of Game Boy Works was a painful learning process, both for me and for you, and by painful I'm referring to the video quality. I created the first episode of Game Boy Works with a handheld Super NES emulator, a junky composite video connection, a Super Game Boy, and no script. I just talked into a microphone for 10 minutes, trimmed the fluffs and the dead air, shrugged at the blown-out audio and inconsistent volume levels, and paired it all to some wretched, standard-definition gameplay footage. The occasional production glitch or temporary setback aside, my current standards for video production are a lot higher than where I started. I'm very lucky in that a few people liked the idea of what I was doing, if not the results, and helped set me up with more suitable production gear, including an upscaler, an RGB cable for Super NES, and a more accurate Super Game Boy 2. Now I'm producing material in 4K with sufficient quality that you might accidentally mistake this for professional work if you're not looking too carefully. Games like Castlevania The Adventure and Heian-kyo Alien deserve a fresh look with this superior setup. On top of that, I've learned a lot about some of these games since I first started this project. I've always seen my books as the final product for the work series, where I correct errors and touch on overlooked facts, but I would still like to revisit some of those raw early videos and get them right. I've spent years hunting down all kinds of additional reference material, video resources, and information that I didn't have access to when I started this series. And hell, the entire nature of what it means to capture footage from vintage consoles has radically evolved in the past decade. When this channel first kicked off, the only way to produce authentic footage was to figure out how to squeeze the best possible video from aging hardware. And there's still value in that approach, especially when you're dealing with some of the more esoteric platforms out there, but the convoluted recording setup I used in my early HD videos isn't really necessary. I could just load up the Super Game Boy core of an FPGA device like Mister or Analog Pocket and record directly to digital. But mostly, I want to keep pressing forward with the NES Works Chronology because we've arrived at the era of gaming where I cut my teeth. I mean, I'd been playing arcade games for years by this point in history, but the NES really drew me in. I bought an NES at the beginning of 1988 and spent most of the following year playing catch-up. But by the time summer 1989 rolled around, I was in pretty deep. I was reading all the new magazines that had begun popping up in the US whenever I could. I borrowed, rented, and occasionally even bought every NES game that looked interesting. I hung out and had sleepovers with like-minded friends, immersing ourselves in video games until we literally couldn't keep our eyes open to keep going. I was there soaking it all in, and the videos I've been putting together lately are the result of not only online and offline research and revisiting old favorites to see how they hold up all these years later, but also a fair amount of lived experience. In other words, NES Works and its companion series are one old man's desperate effort to justify a youth wasted in front of a TV screen. I may have ruined my eyesight and forsaken any prospect of ever being physically fit, but at least I came up with the material for a great video series, you know? So thanks for sticking around these past 10 years, especially those of you who subscribe to my Patreon, which makes it possible for me to track down the materials I feature here and in my books. Here's to another 10 years, at least. Hopefully more. I'd like to make it to the end of NES at least, even if I'm hitting post on my Wario's Woods video with a skeletal hand from my hospice bed. So I'll see you back here every Wednesday, and every weekend for exclusive or early access goodies if you're a Patreon subscriber.